in our health and wellness, virtual health and wellness site, we have been trying to push information that's available to you and to professional faculty and staff and to students to kind of help you with your own adjustment and your own management of the stress of this transition, of this time. A deep level of appreciation for the amount of collaborative work that I've seen among all of us, and also just a deep admiration and congratulations to those of you that are managing this despite the stress, and also those of you that are managing different hats, from having children at home to adjusting to a small workspace to try to teach remotely, to also maybe caring for those that are at risk. So my deep admiration for all of you with that. As we've kind of looked at thinking about this aspect of this adjustment and how this kind of amplifies our own sense of stress, we also have to think about how this is affecting students and our interactions with them. I think all of you are probably experiencing some of their stress, and they're communicating that stress and anxiety to you. And in looking at that, how do we manage that in a way that we can do it authentically, instead of putting ourselves in a role of counselor or therapist or a person that is responsible for rescuing them from their anxiety? How do we work authentically with them as ourselves, but effectively in helping to kind of manage their anxiety around this current situation, but also just generally? As we look at some guidelines of how to manage student anxiety, you'll see that I am very intentional about, we didn't want to become real heavy on counseling skills or counseling strategies that would actually then kind of put pressure on you to feel like I have to be my student's therapist, or I have to develop a sense of responsibility of reducing their anxiety. Instead, we wanted you to think about some guidelines that you could apply to just your normal way of communicating with your students, and your normal way of kind of how you would prefer to work with them around their anxiety. So just a few things for you to consider, and to see which ones fit for you. Try to integrate those that don't resonate for you, that's okay. Just let those go by the wayside and focus on the ones that speak to you at some level. One of the first things to think about is to kind of tune into your own natural response to student anxiety. It's very easy for us to move into a place of over control or avoidance based on just our own comfort level with a student's level of anxiety. And it may be more specific too. It may be general, in that I generally am very uncomfortable with a student that presents anxiety to me. Or it may be more situational, that I'm fine talking about this topic, but this topic, this is an issue that brings me anxiety. So it's important to find and remember your natural response to that, and then try to find that value sweet spot. And what I mean by that is coming back to your values and start to think about, what do I believe is right for me to do here? Even though it may not be comfortable, what is personally right for me in terms of how I want to interact with my student? That brings you back to your center, to where then you can be more open and be able to attend authentically with the student's anxiety. Also, be able to kind of, it's really important for students to feel heard. The situations I hear that are the best case scenarios of students that we'll talk about, that they just appreciate that a faculty member took the time to understand, took the time to hear them. They didn't necessarily fix it for them, or they didn't necessarily change what they wanted, but it mattered that they understood, instead of feeling categorized as to, okay, you're presenting this fits with what I've seen 1,000 times before, and so therefore you're in that category. It's important, if you can and have the time, is to find the time to understand what they're presenting to you and what they're seeking from you. And it basically means active listening and active curiosity into their situation when they bring anxiety to you. And then at that point in time, it's good for you to then explain your why. Students can understand, especially William Ray students, They don't necessarily need you to agree or disagree, but they want to know why. And that allows you to start speaking to your values, what you believe is right, what you believe is fair in your class, and why that is. And it also allows you the opportunity to move them into their why, to kind of move them from a fear state more into what matters to them. But very in a non-defensive way, showing from your actions that you heard them and that you understand them and understand why this is hard for them and anxious for them, and then moving toward explaining, this is why I do what I do. This is why I teach. These are the conditions and the expectations I have, and this is how I do this from a point of fairness, is a way to help them manage the anxiety. The important thing too, in thinking about just one point of nomenclature, is when you get a chance, try to be sensitive to replacing but with and. It's amazing that if we sit there and take the time to listen to them and then go, but what I want to do, it often just feels discounting of what their experience was. But if you put in the word and, both parts hold value. The value of what you heard from them and the value of what you're sharing to them is also important. It would be nice if we could, in our syllabus, just explain our why one time and hope that that was sufficient. And we need to understand that because of what's fueling the anxiety of our students and why, there may be multiple times where we need to step into our why. Being very clear and open, as Maz said, with the expectations in the syllabus, so students can understand from the beginning, as they're discerning their place in your class, understanding the expectations in your why can be very helpful. And there may be multiple times when you'll need to do that during the semester, especially during times when you know things are bubbling up on campus or bubbling up in our culture or the rhythm of our semester. They're bubbling up in forms of what you know of increased stress and anxiety. Reminding students of your why and doing it frequently can be a helpful way of managing student anxiety. One of the most important things I think to do as well is kind of distinguish between sensitivity and responsibility. The purpose of today is to kind of increase our awareness and sensitivity to young adult student issues today, and being sensitive and understanding their perspective, not only generally, but as each student comes in with their own unique story to you. It's great to be sensitive to that. It's also very tempting to step into being responsible for their emotions or responsible for fixing their emotions or rescuing them from their anxiety. And that really is an unfair burden on you and can lead to being overwhelming for you. It is interesting that when we moved to this state of responsibility, that's when fear starts to lead again, and we can move into this level of over-controlling or over-advocacy for the part of the student, or that we become so overwhelmed that we just start to avoid it, or we start to move away, or we throw up our hands and say, I can't deal with this anymore. And we become then very rigid in kind of setting up expectations that just don't change. However, if we maintain a level of sensitivity, but not own the responsibility of a student's stress, it gives us a better ability to, one, for them to feel heard, but also to boundary your responsibility and working with them in a healthy way. A couple of other things to think about is when we get afraid sometimes, and this starts to become overwhelming for us, we can become more rigid to our decisions. This is how I do it, this is what I do, and I apply it to everyone. I don't change. However, if we can kind of allow equity and fairness to be our guide, you may find that the more you hear students, like think of the context right now that we're dealing with, fair may change. We've heard the adage before of treat equals equally and treat unequals unequally. It's about looking at what is your concept of equity and fairness in your class, in your interaction with students, and being able to communicate that clearly, and also recognize that as you interact with more students and as we go through a different context, fair may change. for you based on what I've heard that changed the context for me based on this student's perspective, FAIR started to shift for you. Being open to that and then communicating that can be a helpful way of managing student anxiety. It's also really important to kind of remember that many students look to you, they develop almost friendships with you at times. You are their place of trust. For many of you, they're developing a mentoring relationship with, which is wonderful. Never forget, though, that there is still always an evaluative dynamic to your relationship with them. They are aware of that. There is that notion that at some point in their awareness, you are in an evaluative role with them. And that might impact what they share with you. And so in that, what I encourage you to think about is if you ever hear a perspective that doesn't sound right to you, or sounds like it shouldn't be that way, rather than just automatically accept that as fully true, it's important to kind of go and look and see and check that out. Not regarding this particular student, but for instance, being able to call the counseling center and saying, you know, I've heard this from various students. Is it true about your process of intake appointments? So it gives us a chance of being able to respond and say, actually, we have our appointments that students can schedule, but we also have our daily walk-ins. We have clinical teams every day to where if their scheduled appointment is too far out, they can actually see someone every day. And it's not reserved only for emergencies. And so there are opportunities to be able to talk with us and consult with us to be able to understand what our policies and procedures are. And not as in a defensive way, but as a way for you to understand them. You could still possibly disagree with us and give us feedback that would be helpful for us. In addition to consulting with your colleagues and working with your colleagues around these issues, it's also important to recognize the support that's around you for instance, with the studio, for teaching and learning innovation, being able to work with challenging issues around pedagogy and managing student anxiety may be ways that you could receive peer support and collegial support around that. And please know of my availability to you at any time as we kind of work on these things and work through this stressful time together.